Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of Stream Time Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Beecham. Today, we're joined by Richard Kearney, who's the Senior Director of Product Management at MediaCon. And today, we're going to be talking about customer acquisition and retention. So the first question I'm going to ask, and I'll answer because I haven't prepped you guys for this one, is we're talking about, subscriptions and churn and all that. How many services are you currently subscribed to, and what is the most recent one that you churned from? So I'll answer the question first to give you guys some time to think about it. I'm currently subscribed to Disney Plus, Prime, NFL Game Pass, Apple TV, Spotify, and The Athletic. And I think those might be the 6 subscription services that I'm currently subscribed to that I can think of off the top of my head. And the one I've most recently churned from outside of the sports world, Nick, because I'm expecting a child soon, is I have canceled my Xbox Game Pass subscription, partially because I'm anticipating not having as much time to play games.
Yeah.
They're also having a price increase. So, yeah, I think I'm currently subscribed. I think I listed off about six there. Some of them TV and media, some of them, The Athletic for the editorial side, Spotify for my music. But, yeah, Nick, I think it's 6 services I'm subscribed to. You know how many you're subscribed to?
I'm not exactly sure the number, but I think it's even less than that. I would say it's about 4 or 5. Most of the ones you said, I don't think I currently have a Disney one, but I have an Amazon Prime, which replaces that. I've got Spotify and I've got a couple of others. I get actually The Athletic, but I get it randomly through my Revolut account. There's a premium tier that I get that for free, plus a few other things that make it worthwhile. So that was an interesting and random addition when I was living overseas in Jamaica, as I had to use Revolut as the means of transferring and exchange. And but I happened to get access to all these awesome premium subscriptions that I was already using. So it was a great way to definitely. We're going to be talking about retention here. It definitely kept me using them as a result of that because it was too good an offer not to refuse. So I'm about the 4 mark, I think.
Yeah,
what about you, Rich?
Rich.
I think I've got from a consumer streaming service perspective, I think I've got pretty much all of them, from Prime Video to Paramount Plus to Netflix, HBO Max, which is now HBO Max again. And Hulu. Yeah, basically all of them. And then some of the more niche ones, like I had Masterclass, which my wife and I both are big fans of. And then on the music side, I've got Apple Music. I don't have any of the sort of like virtual MVPD stuff, though I've considered that for some of the sports piece.
Yeah.
But, to your note there, Nick, of like the ones that come included with certain things, I have no idea which of those I'm actually paying for directly or I'm getting from my like Disney Plus. Was it through Verizon or is it not through Verizon now? I don't remember. I might be getting double billed for all I know. And then some of them are ones that I got for free as an employee at previous companies, and they're not very good at auditing and removing those things. So in some case, I think I'm still gliding off of a subscription I got for free 10 years ago. They just never shut off.
And I've got a few where I've kept them since I've moved to 2 countries, and I tried to change them to get at least in the local currency, and I couldn't. That wasn't going to happen for me easily. So I've kind of given up on that a little bit. At some stage, I'll get the wherewithal to commit to going the whole cancellation process and then trying to resubscribe. But they don't make it easy for us. But there's obviously a little bit of intent in that, obviously. So that's something we'll dig into a little bit today.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking even, Nick, I have a story like yours. I originally had Apple TV because it came for the first year for free when I purchased a new iPhone. And at the time, it was only like $2.99 per month. And I was like, actually, if anyone's not on Apple TV, they have great TV shows. But it was a bit like, I had it for free for a year through my phone, and then I just let it roll and just haven't touched it for the last 4 years.
Sounds like you've been caught in the classic subscription tactic there as well. It seems that we're a few... we followed the trend that all basically good marketers want us to follow. So there's maybe some proof in the pudding after all. But let's jump into it, Chris.
Absolutely. So yeah, Rich, I mean, today we're going to talk about subscriber acquisition and retention, and we're going to go through as well some of the technology and the AI behind that. And before we jump into that, I think just a little bit of an interesting background from yourself. I introduced you as working at MediaCon, but before MediaCon, just for context, I think you've only been there for about 3-4 months now. You'd previously been at Paramount, and Paramount have obviously launched Paramount Plus, and you've been around some of those products. Maybe just give a little bit of a background, sort of what your awakening has been going from working at, the broadcast or the distribution side to now going to that service provider side, and sort of what some of that has been like, that transition from a career perspective or just a background perspective?
Yeah, no, of course. So I have been in product management for almost 20 years now. So essentially my entire career. And all of that has been in media and entertainment. And the vast majority of that has been in video streaming, and a lot of that in subscription video streaming. But all of my career prior to MediaKind was on the consumer side of that. So I worked for a bunch of startups early on, but in terms of more household names people would know, I worked at AMC Networks for a number of years, where I launched their first direct-to-consumer streaming service years ago. And then for the last 8 years prior to joining MediaKind, I worked at the Paramount Corporation, as you mentioned there. And for the first sort of 6 years of that, I worked at Showtime, which was a US-based streaming service. I know the brand name's known a little bit more internationally, but as some streaming service people subscribe to, US-based for those 6 years. I was VP of product there for a number of years, running both the Showtime direct-to-consumer OTT service as well as the Showtime Anytime TV Everywhere service, where you authenticate through your MVPD or MSO subscription. And then we made the decision to fold Showtime into Paramount Plus about 2 or 3 years ago now. And so I worked very heavily on the sort of trying to migrate all those subscribers over so we didn't lose revenue for that. And then for the last 2 years, I worked at Paramount Plus, where I was a VP of product in the content discovery and engagement group. Now, that is very relevant to this conversation, because that's very much about both the two sort of high level levers here, but one is personalization of content recommendations to end users, but also merchandising of your most important IP that's most relevant to people, and then finding a healthy balance between those things in order to drive content engagement, which reduces churn, extends subscriber life. And now in my role at MediaKind, I'm focused on our MKIO platform product, which takes our sort of flagship MKIO AV processing pipeline product and then builds on top of that as a full-on direct-to-consumer streaming platform, like a white label streaming service, essentially. And what I'm bringing in my focus there is all these lessons I learned and all these tools that I built at places like Paramount to drive engagement and reduce churn, and trying to make that extensible to our entire customer base.
So just on that, Rich, could you just explain for those that'd be interested to hear on the MKIO standpoint, how does that plug in to someone's perhaps existing ecosystem? How does that all play out when MediaKind come to the fore?
Yes, I mean, there's many different ways that can happen. And sometimes it's a greenfield situation where maybe it's a sports league that has some rights and they're interested in launching from scratch a new streaming service, and certainly our product maps very well to that use case. Sometimes they have an existing encoding and process, when I say the full sort of pipeline there, right, like encoding, packaging, CDN, the DRM, all the aspects of the video stack is that sort of core MKIO piece. And then when I say the platform, what you're sort of adding on top of that is the entitlements to the content. So we understand who users are and what they have access to in terms of content in order to enforce that, but that also drives the recommendation aspect. And then also content discovery. So the APIs that power your search experience, things that power when you go into your homepage, what rows you're seeing, what the content is inside of those rows. So all of those tools come together to form what we're doing. And we do that for both OTT customers, and also we have a long legacy of doing that for pay TV customers as well. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of the stack. And it's either people who are migrating from somewhere else or, like I said, greenfield situations.
And like you just talked about a greenfield situation, building it from scratch. So maybe that's where we'll start this podcast, talking about, you're building a streaming platform, and you're kind of going through, and we've had a similar conversation with the previous guest who built a new platform, talking about the acquisition phase and sort of what are some of the important metrics or considerations you have, particularly maybe when you're trying to define what success is on that, because you're obviously trying to bring in new subscribers, but also once you get them, you don't want to lose them either. So maybe you're thinking about building that new platform, sort of the prioritization, like you got to get new people on to even get it off the ground. But also if you don't keep them on, well, you're going to have a lot of work finding new subscribers. So just sort of that initial phase when you're launching a new product, where you're balancing that at.
I have launched from scratch a ton of products in my life. I mean, a lot of the acquisition piece is more of a marketing concern, I would say. But whether you're launching something from scratch or whether you're talking about a mature service with free trial users, for example, the challenges are largely the same, which is that you have very little data about these users coming in, right? Beyond maybe if you have if you're instrumented correctly, hopefully you understand what the acquisition piece of content was that brought them in. Like, what was the ad campaign? What piece of content did they specifically see an ad somewhere for that they click through to your service, for example, and then making sure that follows them through their onboarding experience in order to drive and recommendations, things like that. And I think of all of this, just establish at a high level, my learnings, whether we're talking about conversion or retention, is that really the only way to reliably increase those numbers is through increasing content engagement. As obvious as that sounds, like A/B test after A/B test across years and years, the only way you can reliably do that is by making your content recommendations better, or having better content, obviously, but that's a separate issue. Getting people to watch more content. And in the context of free trials, that can be difficult because we have what we call the cold start problem, which is that you really know nothing about what they've watched previously. So, for example, one thing that we did at Paramount Plus is we had what we called our content picker UX, which was a part of the onboarding flow that quite literally asked people to identify what programs on our service they were interested in. And obviously, we leaned towards pieces of content that were more popular things on the service. The Yellowstone spinoffs and Halo when we had it and things like that, right? Or different, the NFL on CBS, for example, and then have them pick those things so that the very first time that they hit the homepage, it would actually be a fully sort of personalized homepage because it was driven by content recommendations related to the programming that they literally just told us that they were interested in watching. And one of the good news things there is, which I think people who might want to implement a strategy like that should think about, is that can be a sort of annoying or difficult user experience to go through on a TV-based user experience, but it's pretty easy to do on a mobile app or on a mobile web or like a web UX. And the good news is that even though most of your consumption happens on TV-based devices, generally speaking, your acquisition, a lot of it happens on that mobile and web interface. And so it's entirely appropriate to just sort of have that concept picker user experience there, to have a good balance between not slowing people down getting into the product, but at the same time learning as much as you can in order to have relevant recommendations once they get past that sort of onboarding experience.
So, Rich, just curious, you talked about that journey between acquisition to be able to then serve a personalized set of options. How, when I've talked to people, just general consumers, they kind of sometimes will get frustrated with like being able to find the right content on a platform. How robust is that capability now to be able to serve a recommendation that is directly linked with what created the acquisition in the first place? And how long's it taken? Sorry, how long has that been available, I suppose, and working effectively?
So I think there's a couple of interesting topics here that you touched on. One, in terms of the user experience aspect, I think this goes well beyond streaming services. This is a general dynamic that people have complained about on the internet, particularly over the last few years, where, and I think this affects the tech industry on the whole, where, as long as there is growth to be had that is somewhat organic, then it's fine to focus on the best user experience possible without thinking too much about optimizing for juicing your key metrics, as opposed to just having noble ideas of great user experience. But as soon as you kind of, like Netflix ran into this challenge, this is where you start seeing things like the password sharing crackdown and things like that, and this affected the industry on the whole, I guess it was almost 3 years ago now, where Netflix for the first time had, they reported their quarterly numbers and they had lost subscribers for the first time ever that quarter. And that sort of kicked off the whole industry-wide freak out about focusing on revenue and profit, not just subscriber growth, because everyone had been juicing that, taking it back to our earlier conversation, by including it in your Verizon account, including it in your Revolut and everywhere else. Right. And Wall Street kind of caught on to that and freaked out a little bit.
I remember that. I remember that window of time very, very well, where the whole market turned on its head. Netflix price plummeted. There was existential questions being asked across the entire industry, and look where Netflix is now.
They it pivoted, and I think a lot of the advertising growth, has had a lot to do with the sports focus in the industry, has been about not just looking at that subscriber number, but looking at that revenue number, and particularly sort of the ARPU, or like the average revenue per user, became the metrics that services started to look at with more intent internally. Like certainly we were monitoring that constantly at Paramount Plus of like, should we be more pushing people towards our premium ad-free tier, or should we push them towards that cheaper tier that includes ads? Because depending on the season of the year or whatever we're tracking, sometimes that ads plus the smaller subscription fee is actually more average revenue per user than that premium ad-free plan. So people are constantly looking to optimize that. But the reason, I brought that up in the context of this user experience question is because, once you get to a certain level where you're not going to get, like, everybody in America has heard of Netflix at this point. It's not a question of identifying net new people who have never had Netflix. It's about deriving more revenue from the existing population of people out there who know about it all. And that's just an optimization game. And a lot of that is this recommendation stuff. But, what ends up happening, and this is often a subject of fierce debate internally at companies, especially between the user experience and design folks, is when you do things in the product that seem like they're kind of anti-user in a way. Like a good example of this is the continue watching or resume watching row that every service has, right?
Yeah.
I think most people that I talk to, what they would prefer is that is the number one row on their homepage all the time, and they don't have to go looking for it. Because from an end user perspective, you're trying to get in there and get into a piece of content and stop fiddling with your remote as soon as possible. But there's a bunch of A/B tests that you've been running that show that if you push that thing down to row number 5 and you force them to be exposed to the content you want to recommend in rows 1 through 4, the numbers bear out that person ends up watching more average minutes watched of content per month than somebody you didn't do that to. And so you end up in this thing where the priorities are a little bit mixed there of what the user ostensibly wants versus what is driving the business.
Well, and what they think they want versus what actually makes the right impact, which I think is a constant challenge in this world. So what, Chris, I'll let you take the reins.
No, Nick, I love it. You're in the zone right now. You do your thing. I can see you're intrigued.
Well, I'm just curious because, Rich, that example you gave is a great example of how deep we can go into sort of curating that experience. Just talk me through about, what's the role of AI playing in that today and how you're seeing that impact? Because everyone in the last 12 months alone, what we've seen across the entire industry, everything we've been talking around with sports media is AI is being brought up in almost every facet of sports media. And actually, I think only really in the last few months, I've seen it being talked about publicly anyway from some of the big streaming players of its role in creating a personalized experience. Just talk us through what that looks like.
Yeah, so at a high level, I think an important distinction to make that really colors the way that I look at all of this is that, right, AI is very much an umbrella term. And a lot of people nowadays will use AI interchangeably with generative AI / large language models / transformer models. But you have more, it's funny now to call it traditional because it's only like 10, 15 years old, but more traditional machine learning driven models for recommending content. Because, services like Netflix, and I mean, I launched machine learning driven personalization on Showtime, and I think like 2018 or something like that. I don't think there were, many years before anything like ChatGPT existed. So when I look at the opportunity with AI, I look at it in the context of how it can improve upon the traditional machine learning approach that has been being optimized for many years by the Paramount Pluses and Netflix, so the global streamers, let's call them. And an important thing to understand is how AI impacts it. There's sort of 4 different, like we're talking specifically about content recommendations. So content recommendations, there's basically 4 different high-level approaches to that. I'm not going to get into like specific types of models and algorithms or whatever, but at a high level, you've got what we call content-based filtering, which is saying, okay, this piece of content is similar to this piece of content. Maybe they're both Westerns or something. And so the person watched this Western, recommend this one. Then you have more collaborative, the challenge with that, with content-based filtering is it requires really good metadata about your content. Because the better the metadata is that you have, the better you can be at understanding similarity between content. The second one is what we call collaborative filtering, which is more users who watched this also watched this. We don't necessarily care whether or not there's an explicit tie between those things based on metadata, but we've just seen patterns that users who watch this also watch this. And then there's the hybrid approach, which combines both, which is what pretty much every global streamer does, some mix of that. And then sort of the fourth one is more sort of global popularity, for lack of a better term. Like, what is everybody watching? What's trending content, essentially? And so now that we bring LLMs in, they're able to and it just specifically makes sense for sports too, but it really helps sports in certain ways that it's not, that sports has always been traditionally a bit more challenging to understand. So like that content similarity piece, for example, that enrichment of metadata years ago, when I was at Showtime, we have whatever metadata about our movies that we get from, let's say we're licensing a bunch of movies from Warner Brothers or something like that. Like they would license us those movies and provide us whatever base level metadata, what actors are in a short description of the movie. But there's a lot more metadata about like the mood and all these different things that the content has that we would go off to a TiVo or a Grace Note or somebody, lots of people do this, and license all that additional rich metadata from them and then feed that into our recommendation system. Nowadays, with LLMs, you can do metadata enrichment that's like, let's go out to the hive mind of the internet, basically, and enrich and pull in all of this metadata additionally that traditionally you'd have to get from, a Grace Note or a TiVo, and be able, it's not going to be as structured as that data, right? But you're able to have better metadata enrichment of the content. So that's just like one example of how you can start to identify and enrich your metadata and understand, let's call it like semantic meaning. Because like traditionally, when you look at two pieces of content, you can really only be like, okay, are there keyword matches essentially between the descriptions, between the list of the actors, or between the genres? But this is able to say, okay, what does this content really like mean? What is it the story about? And then find similarities that you would not find between content with traditional sort of keyword-based matching and sort of just general metadata. That's just one example, but I could go on for a very long time of different AI use case examples.
Well, I think one of the things would be interesting, you spoke a little bit about this, you and I beforehand, AI is kind of the engine behind personalization. And I think whether it is retention or even that initial acquisition phase is the degree of personalization you can provide for an individual user. But one of the things you kind of discussed is the scalability of that personalization. Like you could turn it all the way up and be incredibly personalized. But is that necessarily kind of in your best interest to do so? Sort of kind of like, what is the level of, letting people still organically discover stuff versus, turning up, the AI too high? Are there any risk of being too personalized with it?
It's an interesting question. And I think there's
I'd like to know how far you go with that. Like how far is too personalized? But I'm intrigued to see how you tackle that one, Rich, because I'm a bit of miss as to what too personalized might be.
I think there's comfort level. First, if you're gonna ask me my gut instinct here, my gut instinct is that if you look at the numbers on things like TikTok or Instagram, I think it's safe to say that you really can't go too far from a personalization angle in those contexts. Now, granted, these contexts are a little bit different, right? We're not talking about solving the problem of. So I'd say that at a high level, I don't think you can go too personalized. But the reality is, you don't have an infinite pool of content in your content library, right? So it's a different. The more content you have, the more you're going to get out of your personalization approach, right? Because you can create a much different service basically for each end user. But when you have a limited amount of content, that's not true. And also, there's always the challenge of, something that always came up, I think, at all the global streamers, is that you've got content that are your original pieces of content you produce yourself, and then you've got content that you license from somebody else. And so while the algorithm traditionally won't care about the acquisition method of a piece of content, it's just trying to find people things they want to watch, it might be more in your interest from a financial perspective to get people to watch content where the economics a little bit better for you than the content that you license from somebody else. So like that's one dynamic that you need to manage. There's also something that I've heard anecdotally from like Netflix, for example, when they started doing original programming for the first time, which came on a little bit later in the life of their service. You had fully optimized homepages, but let's say some movie star, I'm not going to name names, so I've heard stories. Some movie star has a brand new movie that was $100 million budget that they've made for Netflix, and they log in on the Friday night that the movie came out, and it's not on their homepage.
Yeah.
And they're like, what? Because that's just the nature. They don't show things to people they don't think they're going to want to watch. So if the data suggests that, whatever. So I think we've all gone through that, where we hear about a show on Netflix or something from a friend, and you're like, that sounds perfect for me. I've never even seen that on the homepage. And then you go look it up. You're like, that's weird, So you do need to balance, as I talked about at the very beginning, let's talk about my role at Paramount Plus, balancing sort of merchandising versus personalization. And two of the key tools that we had for that there, and which are things that I'm have on the roadmap now at MediaKind, is you have sort of a pinning approach, which is to say, okay, for example, let's say you think the content resume watching row I talked about before. If you believe that that should be the top row always, or if you are a live sports person and you want to make sure that any live game right now is always at the top of the page, you can pin that and say, okay, let the algorithm decide the order of the rows for each individual user based on their projected affinity for that content. But make sure, regardless of the recommendations, it's not allowed to not put that as the top row on the page. And the other thing we do is sort of a max min, which is to say like a maximum minimum position on the page. So let's say your editorial team, they put together a whole thing of like movies related to Halloween. And we have a bunch of movies that we license that have to do with Halloween and we want people to watch them. So let's put that row up, and let's say that the floor for that is 10. So it's not allowed to be lower than row 10 on the homepage for any individual user because, hey, we're spending a bunch of marketing dollars out here promoting and driving people in to watch that stuff. We want to make sure they don't miss it when they come in, right? So part of it is like, that's one way to make sure that your marketing spend is aligned in a way that your recommendation system is not going to be good at understanding. And so you have that ability to override that in order to have better merchandising of your content.
So, Rich, I mean, the idea of this whole ability to personalize the experience when people come on is obviously really appealing. But we've been talking a lot and using a lot of examples of the big global streamers. Just talk about how far can that go in terms of the ability for someone who's maybe a challenger platform or a sports property to be able to bring that personalization to the level that perhaps we're talking. Is there a threshold where there's only a limited amount of personalization available at the lower end, or is it really transferable at all levels and worth doing, I guess, and worth the resource commitment to it as well?
So I sort of teased this out a little bit earlier, but didn't speak to it at great length. But when I was making that distinction of machine learning versus like the new large language model versions of AI, the most important thing, and I gave metadata enrichment as an example, and that's one, but there is like multiple other ways in which AI tools now make it more scalable and give an opportunity for companies to kind of shortcut where they did not spend the last 10 years fine-tuning a machine learning algorithm about their content in order to whatever. So, and the three different ways I think that happens are, one is curation. So the curation of what you have there, right? Like, and where curation meets personalization, because those things are fully hybrid at this point. They're not separate concerns necessarily of like, here are rows on the homepage that an editor came up with manually versus these are ones that, an algorithm came up with. There are, Netflix is a good example here in terms of work they had to do manually that is now accessible and scalable for other people, right? Like the homepage is not just saying, hey, there's 20 different rows on the homepage. Every user sees the same 20 and they're just in a different order. It's instead saying, we have a pool of maybe 1,000 different rows that could show up on the homepage ostensibly. And then we're going to figure out the right subset for this user based on what they've watched before. But in order to have that pool, which not everybody's sitting on, what Netflix did 10 years ago, whatever, was go through and basically manually tag this content with what the mood was, like, oh, these are shows that are set in Paris. These are shows that are set in Berlin. These are like every level of little bit of data about the thing in order to then generate like what I'll call micro genres, essentially.
Yeah.
But that was done manually. An LLM can look at the content in your content database, identify that level of structured data of different sort of fields about that content, and then suggest an entire pool of different ways to curate your content, which you could essentially then just sort of review and go, oh yeah, I like that one. And then there's that little bit of control. Taking it back to your part about how far you can go at personalization. People do think want some degree of control. You're in some cases a public company with shareholders. You're not okay with some relationships between content that the LLM might figure out and present that are a little bit taboo from your perspective. You're not comfortable with that, right? So it's about the curation piece that AI is helping with to make it scalable for smaller companies that don't have the same, level of people internally. And then also sort of the context piece, which is an improvement over, this is helpful for sports content as well, where traditional models of machine learning were not very good at understanding real-time context. It's 7 p.m. on Saturday night, or they just went to the search page and typed in baseball 5 seconds ago, or or like they literally just finished watching this game, but this NFL football game with these teams or whatever, right? Traditional models are more, okay, let's look what the user watch and every 24 hours, let's increment the list of recommendations for them on the service, versus in real time, let's augment that data with what do they literally just do. And that's very helpful, I think, for sports content where it's more of a real-time aspect to it. And also where that content is not as structured, meaning like, movies and series all sit in some database somewhere where they have unique identifiers that everyone understands across multiple systems. Sports lacks that sort of structured metadata regardless of league thing, right? Like there's not some database of players across every sport that you can reference and have good data around. So it helps with that problem as well.
I'm just thinking now, just a little bit outside the box, and Nick got me thinking on this, is when we do talk about sports, we get more of these direct to consumer platforms where they aren't just all about content. They're also selling merchandise or they're selling additional products to that. Just curious, from your perspective, how much can this data then be connected across like your broader ecosystem, in terms of wanting to be able to connect what my D2C platform is. I've acquired a customer, and then you talked about earlier, like actually the metric is probably ARPU. Are there ways for me to be able to, kind of connect what I'm doing from a content side if I'm, I'm DAZN, I've subscribed to NFL Game Pass, are they going to be able to help the NFL drive me to buy tickets for the Wembley game? Are you able, how easily is it to connect some of those learnings and data to potentially drive ARPU into other places that just isn't strictly content if you're building that kind of one-stop shop platform?
Yeah, and that's certainly a major focus of many of our customers, an area that we think about and are focused on a lot from a roadmap perspective. So, and it also ties nicely into, at a high level, I sort of was talking about the different ways in which AI creates new scalable opportunities versus traditional personalization. And, gave that metadata enrichment example, the curation example, and sort of the real-time context example. But continuing from that real-time context, which is so important for live, this is more I'd say the next frontier of these things, if everyone's figuring out the right model for this, but what I'll call sort of content understanding, which is saying AI analyzing the video file itself during the encoding process in order to understand what is happening in the video, whether that is that a home run was just hit or whether someone just scored a goal. Because those tend to be the types of triggers people want to tie to this person hit a home run, present an ad to buy the jersey of that player, right? And don't get me wrong, there are existing companies that provide data feeds around these types of things that we have integrated previously into our platform, which then gets into, not to get too technical, but for this audience, perhaps like Scuddy markers and that kind of thing, where like there is that sort of sidecar feed of events that are happening, which you can then react to. But you can also use this for things like, this is, again, frontier, something we're working on, but I'll put more in this sort of experimentation phase of figuring out how to best productize. But things like highlights, for example, right? We have this like catch-up highlights that you see around a lot of services today. You tune into an NFL game, an NBA game, maybe you joined in progress. Let's show you sort of that highlight reel of the videos that happened earlier. That with AI can become much more scalable to include things like fantasy football, let's say. There's a specific player that you're interested in. You're not interested in necessarily just watching all of the field goals and touchdowns that happened so far in the game. You want to see every time that person touched the ball clipped out. And one really cool thing and this is one thing I love to say about MKIO platform and the fact that it uses our MKIO processing pipeline, is that so much of the innovation and flexibility is in that video processing layer. Because if we're already encoding the content, we can do the AI understanding of the content as a part of that flow, rather than egressing that video out somewhere else for content understanding, increasing your latency while bringing it back in and all that. So we try to make it sort of a part of what we're doing. And a really cool thing that we do, which, it does get into technical, but I feel like it's too cool not to mention here, is that so many of these things are about, you generate a bunch of VOD assets, basically, that then need to be stored somewhere and played back to the user. But a lot of these AI things are based around more like manifest manipulation, where it's about finding out what the relevant segments are in the actual, just not a separate video stream, but the video stream of the event and all those segments of the video sitting on the CDN. and figure out what are the correct ones to show to somebody as highlights, and then pull them out of the existing, basically out of the existing video that's already stored there, and then just sort of repackage it for the user to watch it, right? Because you need to figure that out if you're going to scale to truly personalize someday, where somebody goes, I just want to watch all the highlights of Messi and all the goals that he scored in the 2018 season of whatever, right? And like to generate content sort of on demand for users in a personalized way, which I think is sort of the holy grail of the future here. So figure out how to make that scalable is certainly something we think about a lot.
I'll just say, Rich, Nick and I have been hosting this podcast for 4 years now. I've been working in sports for 6 years now. And I've said it multiple times at events. I've said it multiple times at podcasts. If you wanted to just literally take the money out of my pocket, if someone just built a platform where I could upload my fantasy team, and then on every Monday morning, I just woke up to a 20-minute package of just the carries of my running backs, of just the reception, take my money. You can have it included into FPL. Like, I'm begging for it, Rich. If someone can do that, talking about what services would I subscribe to, just take all of my money.
Good to know.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's I don't know. It's an interesting challenge because I think, live is definitely where it's at. Don't get me wrong. And like, it's healthy to have a little bit of cynicism or skepticism, I should say, about the value of that library of VOD assets of all the old games and things like that. But if there's ever technology that I saw that like maybe this is the thing that cracks the nut of figuring out how to repurpose that content in a very entertaining to the individual user way, these technologies are the ones that I look at and go, man, if you've got that, especially as a sports, maybe you license the games during seasons, but generally you retain long-term your library of all those past matches or games or whatever, that perhaps that's a way to leverage it from user experience perspective, make it relevant to users in a more modern way, is to be able to repackage it, again, in a scalable way from a tech perspective. But, it's sort of scary, but like, scary is not the right word. It's a brave new future, a brave new world of, are we moving from a paradigm that traditionally was, okay, I've got all of this content, and now my goal is to figure out how to use personalization to get people to watch my content library, to, do I actually basically generate the content based on what they want rather than this matching game, right? Because it's like, if somebody's describing a show they want to watch, every highlight of my fantasy team, and then we are generating, it might be just a playlist at first, but we're literally generating the content based on their demand. And we're figuring out ways to make that scalable so that each user doesn't just get a different homepage, but each user can have literally content that's generated on the fly for them, essentially. It's a massive, it's the name of the game and the opportunity you're going forward, I think, in general for video.
So, Rich, in terms of all the stuff we've been talking about, I mentioned it before about that delineation between the big players versus maybe the startups or the challengers, or someone who's maybe having to be really focused on, they want to build a really efficient and effective business that is not throwing the kitchen sink financially at some of these ideas and opportunities. Just how impactful have you seen the personalization part of it play a role? Can you give any examples of, look, if you don't, you've seen since implementing X, it had this sort of impact into conversions or into engagement times? What sort of guidance can you give of just the scale of the impact it can have?
I mean, the scale, I can't think of any. I mean, the numbers have changed. I mean, the numbers are so different from test to test of what you're doing, but things that I can say proved out time and time again that they made a material impact on subscription metrics of like a subscription service, for example. And things that I'm leaning into them as things that we're doing at MediaKind, because my belief is that they will drive content engagement for our customers, which will then increase their subscription metrics, which will also drive them to consume more video content, which is also healthy for our business of more video being processed and everyone wins. But specific things that have a material impact, certainly personalizing the order of the rows on your homepage certainly does that. Personalizing the sort order of content within the rows. I mean, as a general principle, people tend to stay to the left side of the page and go down. So like you need to optimize for the content. The top left corner is where you want the content to go that is most personalized to a user. And the first item in each row going down the page is going to have greater engagement than anything that's people scroll vertically before they scroll horizontally, and that's proven out time and time again. So affecting those two things, which is something we're working on in both cases for our customers, that's going to drive material impact. Another one that always, probably the biggest lift of anything I'd say I've done is that sort of watch next experience inside of your video player. I know people tend to think of it as obviously when you're watching a series, sort of autoplay to the next episode of the show. But leveraging that to surface correct content, particularly where the AI comes in for the additional context piece, serving up the correct next things to if you can keep people in the video player, it naturally juices engagement there. And it's not just like, oh, they watched a movie, get them to watch the next movie. A lot of times people are watching the newest episode of a show, and so there is no next episode to bring them into. So you're identifying a piece of content and getting them into there. That is always a huge driver of further engagement there. And then also around sort of push notifications, things like that. But like, and it could be literally push notification. It could be a marketing email. But something we've seen it's been a good driver for customers of ours is identifying what somebody is watching and then sending them push notification stuff that are tied to that. Oh, they started watching the show. They abandoned it. Maybe they forgot to finish that movie. Try to get them to watch that. So all of those are things that drive. And then things that we're not just working on, but we've launched and seen material impact are basically improvements to our search recommend, like our search algorithms, and increasing, I talked about this earlier, but using AI to understand semantic meaning of content in order to drive better content similarity and identify connections between pieces of content you might have missed otherwise, and then show those bet higher up in search results. That has driven material impact for customers of ours that are on that version of our search API, and that's something we're rolling out with more customers over time.
I'm wondering about the just to that, just the do you have anything that stands out to you over your time, whether it's in your previous days or now with MediaCon, that are some perhaps random but outliers, that a trend you can say that, hey, if this person's doing X or not doing X, they're way more likely to churn than someone who's doing Y. The example I actually have that stuck with me, the first times I heard talked about this, was actually years and years ago when the old NBA app existed before MediaCon actually got involved. And there was a stat that was something to do, I can't remember the exact number, it was basically if we saw them consuming non-live content on the platform, that was the best indicator that they were going to stay in and stay on if they weren't just what's coming on for the live. Do you have any interesting outliers that can really point to someone either churning or just staying on as a long-time customer, other than just watching lots of stuff?
Still in the realm of watching stuff, but a little bit more granular on this front of, and whatever the patterns are that exist with our customers, which is a little bit varied from customer to customer. So I don't necessarily have a great answer as it relates to our current customers at MediaCon. I haven't been here long enough to identify those patterns, but certainly in my previous roles, where original series was such a big part of what we were doing, that original series, and particularly users watching more than like free trial conversion, the magic number is getting them to watch that second series. If they come in and they come in, they watch an original series, they try to fit the entire thing into the free trial. They'll often, sometimes, I'm sure we've all done this, you wait until the entire season is done and up, and then you sign up for the free trial, watch the entire season, and leave before the free trial ends thing. If you can get somebody to watch a second original series, or any original or not, get somebody to watch a second series besides the one that they came in and initially watched, that is a dramatic inflection point in terms of the number of people. So we were always, for example, setting that as like an OKR for the quarter or whatever, to be like, try to get that number from one series per user to 1.5 or whatever on average. So that was one that was always a huge one. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the best example of a magic thing that would work as a lever to get people in. Actually, one other one I'd mention here, which I think it's really important not to take the eye off the ball, which is something we care about a lot, is sort of the reliability of your service, certainly. And this is where I love selling MKIO platform with MKIO under it, because it is a rock solid, bulletproof streaming solution, which is why the DAZNs of the world and people and NBA and whatever love our product, is because scalability is through the roof of what we're capable of doing, and the video quality that we provide. And one thing I've seen over time, right, and some of the better quality of experience and observability of what's going on in your platform. And if you can figure out, which we did over time, certain sort of metrics around startup time in the video player and things like that, where you can often do sort of like churn prediction based on certain metrics around video quality, like video quality and video playback and startup time and things like that. Like, it's not just like fix the bugs and make it better. You can often, if you look in the data close enough, and I've done this in some cases, like identified specific metrics that do impact your churn, which is hugely helpful, because while quality of the product, obviously everyone understands, sometimes people churn off of a product because of poor quality, but often that is in app store ratings or in like NPS surveys and things like that. And it's hard to tie that type of data to individual users and their behaviors at scale, like in your engagement data, because app store reviews are completely divorced from the data you have of like usage of the product.
Right.
But this video quality and quality of experience is a piece where you can tie it to user cohorts and understand how the quality of your experience impacts churn.
Yeah. Well, Rich, we're going to have to wrap things up, unfortunately, but I found this incredibly enlightening, because for me, the whole time you've been speaking about this, I've been sat in the back of my head being like, okay, when I'm going through Disney Plus and I'm trying to find a show, I've kind of just always accepted. It's one of those things, like the Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain, or as I sometimes say, you don't need to know how the sausage is made. But today, like, I got to learn a little bit about how like the homepage sausage is made, and just I was sat there being like, you know what, I do kind of behave like that. And so, so I found it really interesting, because I think it's something I've always kind of just vaguely known, like there's a system that's trying to do stuff for me. But I found this really interesting to get more insight to what's actually going on in the back end, the considerations that people are taking into it. So I think Nick and I've always said, anytime we can leave a conversation with someone where I feel like I've learned from it, that's a very good episode.
I'm glad to hear that it was helpful and informative, and I appreciate you guys having me on, and I'm happy to come back anytime in the future if we have other topics we want to talk about. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Great stuff, Rich. Thanks very much. That was super interesting, and look forward to seeing more about what MediaKind's up to. I think they'll be in a significant attendance at the Media Summit next month in Madrid as well. So shout out to that event in a couple of weeks' time. But thanks very much, Rich, for joining us.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much.